Hello, welcome to this little video in which I'm going to talk about English as a Germanic language. And most of what I'm going to say will be based on the first chapter in Old English and its closest relatives by Oren Robinson. Okay, fun fact about me. I grew up speaking English and German, and of course I have very little memory of acquiring my first languages. But I do seem to dimly recall noticing that the words mouse and house not only rhymed, but seemed to be the same words in both languages. Which could have led me to the question, if I had been a miracle child, of asking, are English and German actually related languages? Of course, at the time, I didn't ask these questions, right? But now as a linguist, we can come back to these correspondences and ask, well, why are they there? Are English and German actually related languages? And this is also what Oren Robinson does at the beginning of his book. He says, first of all, if we look at English and German, yes, they share a lot of vocabulary, right? German Mann, English man, or grün, green, haben, to have, singen, to sing, Gast and guest, Vater and father. Even though not all sounds are the same, so you see have has a v sound, haben has a b sound there instead, but you can kind of still tell that these are seemingly, well, that the words are very, very close to one another. Other correspondences are not always quite so obvious, but they're also there. So Pfeffer in German somehow corresponds to the English word pepper. Herz and heart have something in common. Liegen and to lie have something in common. Lachen and to laugh. Knecht and knight have something in common, even though there's a big difference in what these two words mean nowadays. And the same is true for Weib in German and wife in English. Again, there's a meaning difference, but yeah, the words have something to do with each other. And then lastly, there are also grammatical correspondences. So the fact that looking at adjectives in German, we form comparative and superlative versions of adjectives by adding an ER and an ST, as in dick, dicker, das dickste, right? In English, thick, thicker, the thickest. It seems to be the same, even the bound morphemes that are attached to those forms, there seems to be a lot in common there. Or if we look at the past tense forms of regular verbs, lieben, liebte, love, loved, there's some kind of a D or T sound added to the past tenses of verbs. And Robinson even goes a step further and says, it's not only that these regular things correspond, even the irregularities correspond to one another. So if we look at exceptions to these rules, one exception would be the word good in English, good, better, best. And in German, gut, besser, das Beste, right? So again, there's these forms really correspond to one another. The same is true for irregular verbs. In German, bringen, past tense, brachte. In English, to bring, past tense, brought. You see the same things seem to be happening there. Okay, why do English and German share so many correspondences with one another? One could argue, well, maybe English just took over a whole lot of words from German, or German took over a whole lot of words from English, but this can't be true. I mean, this can't be the only reason, right? These similarities run so deep. I think I just showed you that even the grammar, even the exceptions within the grammar are shared between the two languages to a great extent. So the similarities are so ubiquitous and they run so deep that chance and or language contact, borrowing from one language to the other, can safely be ruled out as reasons for these two languages being so similar to one another. The only plausible hypothesis that we can have at this point is that the ancestors of English and German were the same language, or were versions of the same language or something like that. Okay, so this is the general thing that we do in historical linguistics, and that people were doing a lot in the 19th century, for example, which was sort of the heyday of historical linguistics in a way, when a lot of these concepts were first being thought about, is that we construct these family trees where we say, okay, there's a daughter language A, a daughter language B, and let's try to get to the parent language. So the ancestors of English and German were the same language, but there have been sound changes, there have been morphological changes, syntactical changes, semantic changes that have made the two languages develop apart, to the point where today we say they're two different languages, and it's not like if you know one of them, you understand the other language necessarily. Okay, so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is show you the Germanic language family, talk a little bit about the Germanic language family, and then a little bit going into how comparative reconstruction works. So how do we reconstruct the parent language, the ancestor of English and German, for example? Then I'm going to say something about some Germanic sound shifts. And here I'm going to focus on the sound shifts that English and German have in common, and also one sound shift that separates them from each other, which is also pretty interesting. And then lastly, there will be a little bit about culture or history or archaeology, where we will sort of go a little bit beyond linguistics and say, what can we say, what else can we say about the speakers of these Germanic languages? Okay, English and German are not alone in having so much in common. There are also other languages like Frisian, Dutch, Afrikaans, Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, and so on that have a lot in common with one another. And if you look closely here, this is how the Germanic language tree is reconstructed, mostly as having three branches. But we're going to get back to these three branches at the end of the video. Okay, comparative reconstruction was done a lot in the 19th century, so roughly 200 years ago, by linguists at the time. And this is how it works. French and Italian belong to the same language family, and we call this language family the Romance language family, and their common ancestor is Latin. Okay, this is a fact that is known to a lot of people, I guess. English and German, to return back to our languages right now, English and German belong to the same language family too. We call this language family the Germanic language family. But what is their common ancestor? Okay, we don't have anything like Latin, which would give us texts from 2,000 years ago or so, which would be something like Latin for present day Italian or for present day French. We simply don't have any texts like that, right? So 2,000 years ago, people like Julius Caesar were writing their texts in Latin. But if you went to the north of Europe, texts weren't really being produced there, right? So how can we find anything about the common ancestor of English and German? Well, this common ancestor has to be reconstructed, which is why it gets a fancy name. It's called Proto-Germanic, and now we're sort of leaving the territory of what is commonly known about languages. So you can learn Latin in school if you want to. You can't learn Proto-Germanic in schools, even though we have some knowledge about Proto-Germanic, but this knowledge is rather indirect. It comes from having reconstructed this previous stage of the language. So Proto-Germanic is a hypothetical parent stage of all of the Germanic languages. But how is this done? It's done by working with cognates. Cognates are words that are similar in form and probably also similar in meaning, so that they must derive from the same word in the parent language. Okay, so English and German share many cognate words. How do we go about finding cognates? Okay, so we need to have some general idea that two languages might be related, and we then need to look for words that are similar in form and similar in meaning. So what you see here in this table coming from the book by Johnson, called something with early English. I forget the title. The History of Early English, I think it's called. There he gives us a list of languages and says, look at the words that these languages have for good and see if you can find the odd ones out. See if you can find, just based on these words that mean good, just see if you can find a language or two that don't belong in this list, that shouldn't be part of this list. So the languages are English, Danish, Swedish, Croatian, Dutch, German, Icelandic, Frisian, and Turkish. And I think it's really easy to see if you look at the right-hand column which languages don't belong in this list, right? So Croatian, dobro, has nothing to do with the Germanic words for good, and Turkish, iyi, also has nothing to do with all of the other words that you see there. This is kind of intuitive. It's sort of easy to see that these two words are not related. So Croatian and Turkish are not Germanic languages. And all of the other languages you see here are Germanic languages. Okay, but now let's go towards Proto-Germanic. So we just saw all of the words for good in the Germanic languages, but how do we reconstruct the original words? So let's begin with a very, very obvious case. Let's look at the first sound and letter, whatever. So of course we don't have sounds from 1,000 years ago, but if we look at some early texts from the time, let's look at the first letter that we find, and therefore maybe indirectly also the first sound that was there, the initial sound in the word for father in some Germanic languages. Now, among the oldest surviving texts in Germanic languages, we find Old English texts. We find some Old High German texts. We also find Old Norse slightly later, Old Norse texts. And we find slightly earlier, so these are among the earliest texts, some Gothic texts. Now, in all four languages, the word for father begins with an F. Okay, so what was the initial sound of the word for father in Proto-Germanic? Obvious answer, F, right? However, note the asterisk here. The asterisk means that this F sound that we're reconstructing now for Proto-Germanic is not to be found in any text directly. It's been reconstructed. It's based on our knowledge of the Old English word, the Old High German word, the Old Norse word, the Gothic word, and so on for father. And based on this knowledge, extrapolated from that, we can say Proto-Germanic very probably had an F sound there at the beginning of the word for father. Okay, now you're probably thinking, why are we doing this? This is very, very easy. Not quite so obvious. Let's take it one step further. If we look for the first sound of the word thou. Now the word thou in English has had a strange history. It sounds very Shakespearean today. That's because this word has dropped out of use, but it is the usual second person singular pronoun, okay? So the second person singular pronoun in the nominative case would be thou in English. In Old English, it also begins with the TH sound so that's what the thorn letter stands for. In Old High German, the corresponding word begins with a D sound. By the way, in modern German, it also begins with a D sound, right? The word would be du in modern German. In Old Norse, we have a TH sound, and in Gothic, we have a TH sound for the second person singular pronoun. Okay, so what do we reconstruct for Proto-Germanic? Big question mark here. The answer that Robinson gives is that we reconstruct a TH sound for Proto-Germanic. Why? Why a TH sound? Why not the D that we could have taken from Old High German? Well, actually two reasons. He says it is simpler to assume that one language made a change from th to d than to assume that 3 languages made a change from d to th. Okay, so just going by the majority here, um, it's actually quite a democratic principle, you could almost say. You sort of go by the majority and say, well, what is more likely, that one language would change its mind about how to pronounce the second person singular pronoun, or that all of the other languages change their minds in the same direction in terms of how to pronounce the second person singular pronoun. So we reconstruct the TH sound simply because it's much more present in all of the Old Germanic languages. The second reason, however, and this reason is not really mentioned by Robinson, the second reason that I would say is maybe just as important is that it is more likely for a TH sound, for a th sound, for a interdental fricative sound to disappear over time and to change into something else than something else changing or being replaced by a TH sound over time. This is just something that we get from comparing many, many languages around the world. We find out that these sounds like th and th are actually marked sounds. That means that in general, humans don't like to pronounce TH sounds as much as they like to pronounce a sound like D or T. So again, this is another reason maybe for assuming the harder to pronounce sound to have been the more original sound. Okay, that was the second step. We can do stuff that's even more complicated though, and look at the words for could and other in Proto-Germanic and try to reconstruct at least partially what was the case in these words, because here is where it gets really complicated. Now, in the words for could and for other, in Old English, you have sounds like ooth. So you have could, for example, for could, and you have other for other. So you have a long oo followed by a, well, in this case, voiced th sound, a voiced dental fricative, or a long o followed by a voiced dental fricative. In Old High German, you have OND and AND. I'm just going by the spelling right now. In Old Norse, you have an U and an A followed by a long N sound. And in Gothic, you have again an U and an A, but this time followed by an N and a dental fricative sound. So you can abstract from this and say, well, Old English always has some kind of a long vowel followed by a voiced TH sound. Old High German has a short vowel in both cases, followed by ND. Old Norse has a short vowel followed by a long N or a double N sound. And Gothic has a short vowel as well, followed by an N and a TH sound or a dental fricative sound. Whoa, okay, so what do we do for Proto-Germanic? And here we could say, well, it gets really hard. But if you look closely, you can already rule out some of the possibilities here because they don't seem to be very close to the original. So the hypothesis is that Old English and Old Norse can be safely ruled out as being very close to the Proto-Germanic. Why can they be safely ruled out? Because if you compare them with Old High German and and Gothic, then Old High German and Gothic both do something that Old English and Old Norse don't do. Namely, they have an N sound and some kind of a dental or alveolar consonant sound after the N. Now, Old English seems to have gotten rid of the N, right? So the N was dropped from Old English, maybe turning the vowel into a long vowel instead. And Old Norse seems to have gotten rid of the dental or alveolar consonant behind the N. It instead just has a long N sound, sort of maybe to make up for that loss. So we can rule out the Old English and the Old Norse forms as being very close to the original, which gives us Old High German and Gothic as potential candidates for being closer to the Proto-European sound or sound sequence here in these words. But what was the original sound sequence? If we look closely, we can also rule out the Old High German version. Why can we rule out the Old High German version? What's the difference? Well, Old High German has a D, where Gothic has a dental fricative, interdental fricative. And we already have a rule that dental fricatives can change to D or change to D in Old High German, right? So all of these words are not existing somewhere in space, completely isolated from everything else. But of course, we have to sort of keep in mind the other sound changes that we've already seen in the simpler examples. So we already know that th became a d sound in German, which means that the Gothic version, short vowel, followed by N, followed by TH sound, so either unth or anth in these two words, is the closest we can get to reconstructing a possible Proto-Germanic form here for the words could and other. Right. Okay. I hope that this has become clear to you. An interesting little side note, we do find really fascinating things like fossilized forms in other languages. Let me just show you what this means. So looking at all of the old Germanic words for king, probably this word had an original meaning of something like the leader of a clan. Right. Going also the leader of a kuni of a clan is probably what this word would have meant originally. But if we look at the Old English word for king, it's König, right? The Old Frisian word is something like Kening. Old High German is something like Kuning, and Old Norse has something like Konungr, right? And if we take all of these plus other Germanic languages into consideration, historical linguists would reconstruct a form for Proto-Germanic, for the original Proto-Germanic form of this word that meant leader of the clan, which looks like this and is pronounced something like Kuningaz. And what I just mentioned as being so fascinating is that you then find versions of this Proto-Germanic reconstructed form Kuningas in actually existing languages as well. So if we go to Finnish, the Finnish word for king is actually Kuningas. So in other words, the Proto-Germanic form was taken into Finnish thousands of years ago as a loan word from Proto-Germanic speakers who were not writing their language down at the time, and stayed that way, right? Because Finnish is not a Germanic language, and Finnish didn't undergo the same sound changes that Germanic languages underwent. So that now when we reconstruct Proto-Germanic, we find these interesting connections to other languages that have maybe borrowed the Proto-Germanic form from speakers of Proto-Germanic maybe 2,000 years ago. Okay, but that's just a little side note about these fossilized forms. Okay, looking at some of the sound changes. First of all, the sound changes that are typical of Germanic languages and that English and German have in common. This is one thing that Jakob Grimm, the famous collector of fairy tales, roughly 200 years ago, well, he wasn't the first person to actually find this out, but he was the person that made this sound change really popular, really well known, and therefore it's called Grimm's Law today. When comparing languages like Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and Old Germanic languages, he discovered, or he was, as I said, he wasn't the person to discover this, but he was the person to formulate this, that wherever you had a P sound, a P sound in all of the other languages that are mentioned here, you have a F sound instead in Old Germanic languages. So just compare the Old English forms here, fader and fod, where you have a F at the beginning. Compare that, for example, to the Latin words that you might actually already be familiar with. You have a P sound there instead. So the discovery of around 200 years ago by people like Jakob Grimm was that there are regular and systematic correspondences between sounds in cognate words, in related words, in related languages. And Grimm's law can be formulated like this. One part of it says that, well, Proto-Indo-European, that would have been the very, very, very original version of this language, from which then Latin, Sanskrit, Greek, and lots of other languages, the Balto-Slavic languages, the Celtic languages, and so on, split off over time. But Proto-Indo-European seems to have had a P sound there, which then in Proto-Germanic turned into, or got replaced by, or however you want to say it, an F sound instead. And this seems to have happened very, very systematically and regardless of the context. So every P, wherever it was in a word, whether at the beginning of a word or at the end of a word or in the middle of a word or in front of a stress or following a stress or whatever, every P shows up as an F in Germanic languages. And the same is true, interestingly, not only for P, but for T and K. So the P, T, K sounds, those three unvoiced plosives, all became unvoiced fricatives in Germanic. So you see there's kind of a system here. This is a systematic thing that's going on. P, T, and K always become F, Th, and Ch, respectively, in Germanic. This explains correspondences like Latin pater and Old English fader. So the first sound there. It also explains correspondences like capere from Latin, to take, and Old English habban, to have. Well, the meaning has changed there, obviously. It's not, those two words don't mean the same thing, but they are the related words. They are the cognates in Latin and in Old English. Okay, but that's not all. Grimm also, well, in Grimm's law, as it came to be described, there's also other sets of sounds. So this is another triplet of sounds. Proto-Indo-European B, D, and G. So now we're talking about the voiced plosives that were there and that we see showing up in Latin, for example. They all became unvoiced plosives. So they sort of lost their voicing, you can say, whenever they occurred in Germanic. This explains correspondences like the word for two, which begins with a D sound in Latin, actually, duo. And as you know, in English, t, we have toi, we have two today in English. Or if you look for the word for field, in today's English, that the corresponding word would be acre. Or if you think German still has a word that is semantically closer. So we have Acker in German, we have a K sound there, but we had a G sound in Latin. And in the original Proto-Indo-European, there seems to have been a G sound there. So B, D, and G changed to P, T, and K in Proto-Germanic. And thirdly, there's another series of sounds, again, three sounds, again, three consonant sounds that changed systematically. Now, the original sounds here in this, what I call Grimm's Law Part 3, these three sounds are a little bit harder to reconstruct, but it's pretty clear that they must have been something like voiced aspirated plosives. Now, that's a bit hard to pronounce because well, at least the languages that I'm familiar with don't have these sounds anymore. So Proto-Indo-European originally had voiced aspirated plosives like b, d, and g. That's how I think these sounds should be pronounced. So basically like a b, d, or g, but with aspiration going on at the same time. And another thing that's a little bit hard if you know Latin is that these words, these sounds also changed a little bit in the Latin language. So you can't just directly put a Latin word there in the first slot. But they changed to something like fricatives in the Latin language, actually. Okay, but these voiced aspirated plosives, b, d, g, well, became something like voiced fricatives in Proto-Germanic originally. However, then in most Germanic languages, they went on to become voiced plosives over time. So to keep it really simple, we can say that in the long run, these voiced aspirated plosives, b, d, g, simply changed to b, d, g in Germanic, even though that's not really telling the story the way it went. Okay, this explains some very interesting things that you find in the English language. For example, Latin hostis, so we have a h sound there at the beginning. That goes back to Proto-Indo-European g. So we had gostis, actually, probably meaning something like stranger originally. And this word hostis means enemy in Latin, and it gives us words like hostile in English or hostage. So you can kind of feel this. Oh, yeah, that's coming from the Latin word for enemy, actually. However, in Germanic, this sound in the long run changes to a g sound. So, for example, we have modern English guest. Okay? So if you're saying that you're staying somewhere as a guest, right, then the person who's keeping you in their house is your host, right? And you might be staying at a hostel or at a hotel, actually. So all four of these words that I just named are coming from the same Proto-Indo-European root originally, which has something to do with somebody not being from the same place, maybe a stranger. And then depending on what happened in the different languages to these sounds, but also to the meanings, then of course, it's either hostile, so something bad, or a guest, which tends to be something neutral or positive, right? So really interesting stuff that you can see happening there. This has been a sort of simplified version. There's also some rounded versions of some of these sounds, but I'm leaving that out now completely and just concentrating on this. So the simplified version of Grimm's Law is that you can say there were 9 sound changes that come in triplets, so they come in sets of 3. So once again, the unvoiced plosives p, t, k change to unvoiced frigatives, f, th, h in Germanic, and h then usually changes into an h sound in a language like English. The voiced plosives b, d, g change to unvoiced plosives in Germanic, p, t, k, and the voiced aspirated plosives originally b, d, g in the long run became b, d, g in Germanic languages. The fancy thing that Grimm and others found out is that Grimm's law is always true. At least this was their first hypothesis. Then they started running into problems. So if we compare these two words, kintum or kind and hundred, hund in Old English, you see certain sounds that are behaving according to what we would expect according to Grimm's law. So k has become ch, or later on h in English. So the k sound of Latin centum has changed into a h sound, for example, of English hundred. But there's something that's a little bit off, right? So the t should be changing into a th sound in Germanic. However, here in English, it's a d sound that we get. Okay, other linguists a little bit later in the 19th century solved these problems, saying that, well, Grimm's law isn't wrong. It just had to be refined and expanded a little bit. And one very important figure here was Karl Werner, who actually formulated another law on top of Grimm's law. This one is called Werner law. So this acts as a sort of a refinement to Grimm's law. Werner's law states, and this is a little bit more complicated to understand because it has something to do with what's going on in the same word. But he states that Proto-Germanic non-initial, so if it's not at the beginning of a word, Proto-Germanic voiceless fricatives, f, th, ch, and s this time, so 4 voiceless fricatives, became voiced whenever a stress followed these sounds, whenever a stressed syllable followed these sounds, or a stressed vowel sound followed these voiceless fricatives. Okay, so let's take an example because that's very, very abstract. Grimm's law would predict Proto-Indo-European pater to change into father. And this, Grimm's law says, well, this must be what happened. Then Werner comes in and says, yeah, okay, but since we still have a stress following the unvoiced TH sound here, the unvoiced TH sound changes into a voiced TH sound. That's Werner's law, which gives us Father, right? By the way, then its stress shift occurs. And in West Germanic, then only in West Germanic, this the sound then changes to a d sound. So there's another thing that comes on top of that, which then gives us the d sound that we find in West Germanic generally. Okay, the accent shift or the stress shift just mentioned is another shift that took place after Grimm's law and after Werner's law took place, after these sound changes took place. And that's simply the fact that in Germanic languages, then after all of these laws, after all of these sound changes, root syllables attracted the primary stress. And this is something that's very true about Germanic languages. Even today, Germanic languages have a strong tendency to place the primary stress of a word on the root syllable and not, for example, on a suffix. So English still has a lot of words that are true to this rule. Going, right? To undergo something. Something is unfair, right? So you typically don't really stress prefixes like under or un necessarily in the English language. And in German, the tendency might still be a bit stronger even. So in German has a lot of words like that. Behalten, where halt is the syllable. Gebirge, right, where Birg or Berg is the root. Verblasst, right? So the stress patterns in German words and in English words still very much are showing this, that yes, the primary stress in a word or the stress in a word falls on the root syllable, not necessarily on a prefix or suffix, like in other languages. Okay, I also promised to show you at least one sound change, and there is a sound change that separates English from German, and this is called the second Germanic consonant shift, which only took place in Old High German, not in Old Low German, which is also why it's called the High German consonant shift, or the second Germanic consonant shift. Why the second? Because Grimm's law was the first Germanic consonant shift. And so there's a second one, and this one is only true for Old High German, which means that it produced different sounds, again in German, from what we would expect based on things like Grimm's law and Werner's law. So the second consonant shift is responsible for differences between English and German, like to eat versus German essen, t and s. Sleep and schlafen, p and f. Make and machen, k and ch. Here the English words have the original consonants, original meaning Proto-Germanic consonants, and the German words are the ones that have shifted, that have the shifted consonants, because they derive from Old High German, where this sound change took place. Okay, summing it up, some of these Germanic sound shifts that I've been talking about. So from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, we're talking about two different reconstructed languages here. We have things like Grimm's law taking place. Grimm's law is also known as the first sound shift. After Grimm's law, we have Werner's law. We have the stress shift, which means that the words are now stressed differently. One little maybe entertaining illustration here would be the word cannabis in Proto-Indo-European. If you compare that to the Old English form hanap, okay, a k has changed to a ch or a h sound. That's Grimm's law. A b in the last syllable there has changed into a p sound. That's also Grimm's law. Okay, then Proto-Germanic split up into West Germanic, North Germanic, East Germanic. I didn't really talk about that, But then within West Germanic, we have High German, High West Germanic, and Low German, Low West Germanic, which gives us languages like English, Dutch, and Frisian, for example. And there in High West Germanic, the second sound shift took place, which, as I said, separates English from German. And here we can say that the second sound shift is responsible for the forms that you see in yellow here. So Old English Hanep, compare that to the German, to the present day German version Hanf, where there's an F now at the end of that word. So a P turned into an F in certain positions. Other examples would be pepper and pfeffer, tu and zu, dream with a d and Traum with a t, or that and das. Okay. That's so much for my summary. Now, moving a little bit into culture and archaeology and history towards the end today. What can we say about the speakers? First of all, the speakers of Proto-Indo-European. Now, Proto-Indo-European is a language, is a reconstructed language, of course, that must have been spoken thousands of years ago. What do we know? What can we say about them? Who were they? Where were they? Can we actually say anything about them based on the language? Well, if we look for the cognates, that is, if we look in all of these languages, the Celtic languages, languages like Sanskrit, languages like Russian, Germanic languages, and so on and so forth. If we compare all of these words and we look for cognates, which words do they have in common? We find that they have the word king that I already showed you in common. So the leader of the clan is sort of present linguistically in a lot of these languages, from which we can gather that the original speakers, the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, must have been organized in small groups with a leader, right? We find that these words have a word, these languages have a word for daughter-in-law in common. They don't have a word for son-in-law in common. Okay, so why is the daughter-in-law so important? From this, we can gather that probably it was the women who joined their husband's family after marriage and became part of the husband's family, so that people would relate to their daughter-in-law a lot more than to their son-in-law. We find words for snow, words for winter that these languages have in common, from which we can gather that we're talking about a colder region, probably not a hot desert region where these people came from. We find many words for animals in common, not so many words for vegetables or grains in common, spread out among all of these related languages, from which we can gather that the people who spoke Proto-Indo-European relied on hunting and or on keeping animals for food. Apparently, they didn't really have metals yet, so we hardly find any words for metals that these languages have in common. We do find the word for beech tree spread out over some of the subfamilies within Proto-Indo-European. So based on this, now we have to look into zoology, I guess, right? And into biology and these kinds of these sort of see where do beech trees grow, where did they grow thousands of years ago, and so on. And then we can, from all of these little bits and pieces of evidence, according to most theorists, of course there's different theories, but Proto-Indo-European seems to have originated somewhere around the Caucasus region. Okay, and that's maybe as close as we can get safely to saying where this language was first spoken. Okay, but what can we say then about the speakers of Proto-Germanic, now returning to maybe about 2,000 years ago or so? What can we say about them? Well, we do have a bit more that we can work with here, not just the language, but around southern Scandinavia in archaeology, there is the so-called battle axe culture that we find beginning in the 3rd millennium BC. So we do find also traces of pottery, so things that were held in common in terms of making artifacts, making tools and weapons and other things from around this time. So the battle axe culture seems to correspond with the speakers of Proto-Germanic. Greek and Roman historians actually begin mentioning Germanic, the Germanic people, from about the year 200 BC. So we do have some historical sources, most famously the book called Germania, which was written by Tacitus in the 1st century. Yes, then returning to the language right now, we can say that Germanic has 3 sub-branches. I already named them a few times. East Germanic, the speakers of East Germanic mostly went on to Southern Europe and assimilated into the cultures there. So there's no East Germanic language that survives today. We have North Germanic languages. These were the people that ultimately remained closest to their original homeland, which is southern Scandinavia. But also they famously moved to Iceland and other regions. And then West Germanic, which are the languages that then spread mainly over the European mainland and then also towards the British Isles. So English, German, and these languages, Frisian and so on, are West Germanic languages. Okay. If you look into a historical atlas, you find things like this. So this is when people think the speakers of Germanic who lived around southern Scandinavia, so we can say roughly around Denmark, what is today Denmark, originally, when they started spreading over the European continent a bit further. And there you already see Westgerman and Ostgerman there. So of course, named after these Germanic languages, then we also have sort of names of tribes or supergroups of tribes, so to speak. And you can see here from red to yellow, a slow spread over many centuries in the 1st millennium BC is what you see here, where the speakers of Germanic were spreading. A tiny literary footnote, so we can find this culture not only in the battle axes and pottery items that we find there. We also see it reflected in the literature. So we see that the speakers of Old English and the speakers of Old High German, for example, were drawing on the same literary traditions when they were making their texts in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. So for example, in Beowulf, we find formulas like this: Hrothgar Maðurlode, Helm Scyldinga. So literally, Hrothgar spoke, the helmet of the Scyldings. Or a few lines later, Unferth Maðurlode, Ecglaf's Bern. So Unferth spoke, Ecglaf's son. So you always have somebody spoke, and then something designating this guy in other words. And in Hildebrandslied, which is an old High German text fragment, you find the exact same thing being used there, the exact same formula being used. There it says, Hadubrand gi Mahalta Hildebrandes sunu. So Hadubrand spoke, Hildebrand's son. So again, you have somebody spoke and then another name for this somebody. So just to show you a little tiny literary footnote, it's also the literature that connects these peoples with each other. So in a nutshell, to answer my childhood question, yes, German and English, well, my possible childhood question if I had been a miracle child, German and English are similar because they are closely related. German and English are Indo-European languages. German and English are both Germanic languages within the Indo-European language family. And German and English are both West Germanic languages even. So as opposed to Swedish or Danish, which are North Germanic, English and German are even more closely related than they are to Swedish, for example. Or to put it differently, until about 1,500 years ago, English and German were essentially the same language. So what you should have learned from this little video is that German and English share core vocabulary. They share many grammatical features. You should know and remember what cognates are, what Proto-Germanic means, what Proto-Indo-European means. You should have a general, rough idea of how comparative reconstruction works in historical linguistics. You should know a bit about Grimm's Law and maybe recall some details about some of the other sound changes that I only very briefly talked about. And then lastly, the history of the Germanic languages, expanding from around southern Scandinavia. And you should also recall the names of the three general branches of Germanic. Okay, here are my sources, and that's it for now.